Hello and welcome, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight for another of the Adam Smith Institute's Enlightenment Evenings. This evening, as you may know, we are talking about psychedelics. Psychedelic substances have undergone a transformation in the public consciousness over the past 15 years. Most specifically, there has been a resurgence of interest in therapeutic potential of psychedelics. Views have been polarized all along, but recent scientific developments have started swaying public opinion in a more positive direction. So I'm just going to be really quick, and I'm delighted to introduce our speakers for this evening. Thank you all so much for coming down. Firstly, we're having Max Rangley. He's from the Cobden Centre, and Max runs an economic think tank founded by a Member of Parliament since 2014. He's served on boards of other think tanks, both in London and Brussels, and he's put an emphasis on emerging tech, including organising and moderating the future of artificial intelligence roundtable discussions at the European Parliament. He's also taken an interest in psychedelics for many years and how they brought about a revolution in mental health. We're also going to be hearing from Dr. David Erritzøe, and he is the clinical director and the deputy head of Centre for Psychedelic Research and clinical senior lecturer in general psychiatry at Imperial. David conducts psychopharmacological research using brain imaging techniques such as PET and MRI. Since 2009, he's been involved in postdoc imaging research into the neurobiology of addictions and major depression at Imperial. David has been recently investigating brain mechanisms and therapeutic potential of MDMA, ketamine, and classic psychedelics. And we'll also be hearing from Tara. Tara Austin is campaign manager of Psilocybin Access Rights, and she's been a psychedelic medicine advocate since 2015 and has co-founded PAR in 2022, and this is all about improving therapy access. She's also a partner at Ogilvy Behavioural Science Practice and she also hosts Nudgestock, which is a leading behavioural science and creativity festival. Also on the panel, we're having Timmy, who works alongside Tara, but you're also director of psychedelic policy and regulation at the Centre for Evidence-Based Drug Policy, and is the policy director at PAR as well. Also under the Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group, Timmy actually co-wrote a paper with the Adam Smith Institute on the medicinal use of psilocybin. So yeah, that's really all from me. I'm going to get out of the way, and I'd like to introduce Max Rangley first. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much, Mimi, for organising this event tonight. You've done a great job over the last few weeks with this, and also thank you to the Adam Smith Institute for hosting this, and also thank you to everybody who's attending this evening. I hope you find this interesting, what we're going to be talking about, because I really think that psychedelics are the future for a lot of mental health medicine, but actually, as I'll be speaking about this evening, I also think the potential for psychedelics even goes well beyond that. Now, I'm going to introduce a theme which is going to be important to my talk tonight, and hopefully important for understanding this field in general, and that is the importance of categories in science, and in particular, the importance of avoiding category errors. Now, to start with, if we go back nearly 2,500 years to ancient Greece, Aristotle was one of the most important figures in terms of categorizing different sciences, different scientific disciplines, and so on. So, for instance, he classified more than 500 species of bird, mammal, and fish, as well as dozens of different insects. And he originated the distinction between vertebrates and invertebrates, which is, of course, still used today. And you may be thinking, well, that distinction is quite obvious, but really 2,500 years ago, Aristotle was starting with a blank slate in terms of establishing these different categories in science. So it was really quite insightful, to say the least. Aristotle also actually was the first person to write that whales and dolphins are actually not fish, but are mammals. So he saw that they breathe air, but also that they give birth to live offspring, and that they produce milk for their offspring. Yet hundreds of years later in Rome, Pliny the Elder was still arguing against this, saying, well, of course whales and dolphins are fish. They live in the sea. Isn't it just obvious? Now, why is this important? Because in science, making category errors like this can be incredibly important. And even if you go forward a couple of thousand years from Aristotle, from the Renaissance to the scientific revolution, and then most importantly to the Enlightenment, this further categorization of different sciences into biology and so on, for instance, from the late 1700s onwards, was crucial in the huge developments of science that we've had since then. And I think actually that the way people frequently think about psychedelics is one of the worst category errors in modern scientific history. So in general, when we talk about quote-unquote drugs, whether that be drug legalization or drug anything else, we tend to bundle in psychedelics in that category of drugs, quote-unquote, with smoking crack, smoking meth, people getting drunk on alcohol, whatever it may be. And actually, this is more than just a gross simplification. So informally, if you think about it, this category that we put these things in called drugs is something along the lines of stuff that you consume which alters your mind, temporarily puts you in some kind of deranged state. But psychedelics really absolutely should not be in this category with these other drugs. The research that they did at Johns Hopkins University in the US, which has been one of the best universities for studying psychedelics, they also asked people what the experience was like. And the vast majority of people described taking psychedelics as one of the most meaningful, one of the most profound experiences of their entire life. Comparable, for instance, to when their first child was born or something like that. Then also, perhaps more famously, Steve Jobs, the entrepreneur, said that LSD, which he did quite a few times, was one of the 2 or 3 most important things he did in his life. And he did do quite a few important things with his life. But another characteristic then of psychedelics is the fact that they're not addictive. And this again seems strange to people who are not familiar with this field. But if you take LSD or magic mushrooms, for the next few days afterwards, if you take it again, it actually has little to no effect. So it's just an interesting aspect of these, that there's like an inbuilt mechanism so that you can't take them too frequently. So in that respect, in many respects, even let's say caffeine probably has more in common with cocaine, let's say, than psychedelics do. They really certainly do not belong in that category. Now, Ludwig Wittgenstein said, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world." And again, the same might be said about how we categorize things in our minds in terms of analyzing things and thinking rationally. But then in terms of language then, I think it's also important to establish the terms that we use. So for instance, I don't particularly like the term hallucinogen, which has been frequently used for these. Because I think actually the hallucinations, they're certainly not the only component, and I think they're not the most important. And in a lot of the time, they're actually quite incidental to what can be achieved with psychedelics. The term psychedelic was coined by Humphrey Osmond, a psychiatrist who was working in the 1950s, and he was communicating a lot with Aldous Huxley. Around that time, Aldous Huxley wrote his book, The Doors of Perception, and so the term psychedelic literally means mind manifesting, and that is really an excellent term. These descriptions people give of it being just the most profound experience of their life, what that is parts of the mind manifesting that they have simply never experienced before, but they're there for everybody. They're there for everybody here this evening. So this, again, the title of Aldous Huxley's book, Opening the Doors of Perception, it actually comes from William Blake originally. That accurately captures this as well. When people take LSD or magic mushrooms or whatever it might be, it allows people to get a clearer glimpse into the nature of their own consciousness. Now, many of you here this evening will be familiar with some of the different areas of research that has taken place with psychedelics in the last few years. But as a very quick outline, psychedelics have shown high efficacy in, among other areas, treating depression, anxiety, PTSD, end-of-life anxiety, alcoholism, tobacco addiction, OCD, severe forms of headaches, so not just migraines, but also cluster headaches, which can be so bad that some people actually commit suicide. And also social anxiety for people with autism, recently gambling addiction, and also even there's certain physiological benefits. So for instance, with LSD, it can benefit the immune system, and also it has anti-inflammatory effects. Now, yeah, I think as we look at all of these potential therapeutic benefits of psychedelics, we're actually in danger of falling into a second category error in terms of how to analyze these. And that's thinking of psychedelics as really just a particularly effective form of antidepressants, or perhaps a new type of pharmaceutical drug that just has wider applications than most other pharmaceuticals. Yet again, earlier I touched on Steve Jobs, but many entrepreneurs, especially in Silicon Valley, have used psychedelics to increase their creativity. Famously, Elon Musk, among others, have talked about it. But microdosing, in particular, has gained popularity around Silicon Valley, and so that is often taking around 10 micrograms of LSD, for instance, and so that can increase creativity, your problem-solving capacity, and your ability to think outside of the box when solving problems more broadly. Yet, again, for people who aren't familiar with psychedelics, you may be asking, what is it about these things where they can help people with end-of-life anxiety, depression, gambling addiction, and also can increase creative problem solving? And one of the things that brings this about is many psychological disorders are effectively just entrenched forms of thinking, very negative forms of entrenched thinking. And they can often date back to early childhood or indeed traumatic events like war or sexual assault. And so that's where, for instance, therapy like cognitive behavioral therapy aims at repatterning those thought processes. But what most psychedelics do is they can switch off or at least attenuate the default mode network, so that the term that's often used is that different brain regions can then communicate more effectively with each other. So that's how you have this effect when people take LSD or magic mushrooms. That's how you get this extraordinary healing capacity for all of these different forms of mental illness. But additionally, that's where this increased creativity comes from, is this aspect of different parts of the brain communicating with each other in ways that just doesn't normally happen in day-to-day life. Yet, again, thinking of this second category error that I mentioned, of thinking too much of these things now as basically just the next generation of pharmaceutical drugs. Many pharmaceutical companies are, of course, now looking at psychedelics, and one of the areas that they're looking at in particular is how to get some of the benefits, like let's say the anti-anxiety properties, antidepressive qualities, and so on, but without actually people tripping like they do on LSD, for instance. Now, don't get me wrong, that will, of course, have beneficial effects for those people, but they're effectively treating one of the most important components of psychedelics as effectively a side effect. I mentioned earlier the studies at Johns Hopkins and elsewhere, where people overwhelmingly describe taking LSD and magic mushrooms and other psychedelics as one of the most, if not the most profound experiences of their life. And that is really an important component of what can be achieved with these. So again, going back to Humphrey Osmond, who coined the term psychedelics in the 1950s, he had extraordinary success treating alcoholics. And it wasn't, again, in many cases when people would trip on LSD, not only would they give up alcohol, but they would have an extremely life-affirming experience. And from then on, their lives would be a lot more fulfilling in general. So the profound experiences that people get from psychedelics are an important component of what can be achieved here. Now, there's one last theme here I'd like to look at with respect to psychedelics, and that is the science of consciousness. So I touched earlier on the history of science, going back to the ancient Greeks, but also from the scientific revolution onwards. And if we look at what's been achieved over the last 200, 300, 400 years especially, human beings have had an extraordinary increase in their quality of life, largely thanks to all of the developments in science and technology that have occurred in the last few hundred years. Yet actually, our understanding of the nature of consciousness has barely progressed in that time. And many people would argue it hasn't really progressed for the last couple of thousand years or so. There's a great quote from Stanislav Grof, who's one of the psychiatrists who used LSD a lot in the 1950s and 60s. And he said that in the study of the mind and the study of consciousness, psychedelics will be effectively what the telescope was to astronomy and what the microscope is to biology. And that, again, for people who haven't taken LSD or magic mushrooms, that can seem like a strange statement, but actually it's got extraordinary insight, because it really does allow people to peer inwards into the nature of their own consciousness in a way that simply isn't possible in ordinary day-to-day life. And again, this comes back to this idea that when you ask people to describe what it's like, it's very difficult to describe. All people can say is, well, it was the most profound experience of my entire life, or one of the most, and that's that. It's very difficult to describe. The science of consciousness is fundamentally about subjective experience. It's fundamentally different from let's say, doing chemistry experiments in the lab, for instance. And just one last point then related to this. As Mimi mentioned, at the Cobden Centre, we've done quite a lot of work in artificial intelligence over the years. So, for instance, we organised and moderated the AI roundtable discussions in the European Parliament. We've done quite a lot of other political events like that. And actually, to give a little plug, at the moment I'm working on a book on AI to be published by spring and next year, which I'm editing with Lord Fairfax, who was on the AI committees in the House of Lords. So we're inviting experts from around the world to each write chapters for this book on the key issues related to artificial intelligence. And not that long ago, when we were doing some political events in Brussels and elsewhere, if I talked about the idea of AI reaching human level intelligence, people would be like, yeah, I mean, this might happen in 100 years or 150 years or something. But I think more and more people are understanding now that this is likely to happen in the next few years. It's very difficult to predict when, but it's going to happen certainly far sooner than the end of this century. And if we look at some different theories of consciousness, so some of the most popular theories revolve around the idea that consciousness is emergent, let's say. So when something reaches sufficient levels of cognitive complexity, consciousness will just emerge. And I personally disagree with that. I think in the coming years we will see artificial intelligence that will effectively outperform the human brain in all relevant cognitive domains, yet it will not be conscious. Yet, nevertheless, with all of these developments and with developments in brain-computer interfaces, that is, things like Neuralink, I think, again, the fact that our understanding of consciousness has barely developed in hundreds of years, psychedelics will play a crucial role in this in terms of developing our understanding over time. And so to conclude then this evening, I've touched on a few key points. First of all, this idea of category errors in science. I think treating psychedelics within the category of just drugs, along with smoking crack and meth or anything else, is absolutely one of the worst category errors in the history of modern science. But then I also think with all of the incredible developments recently in terms of using psychedelics for treating mental health problems and all the various other things I touched on, I think we're actually in danger of falling into a second category error of thinking them really as just pharmaceutical drugs, that when people get depressed or get anxiety, they go to their doctor and get a prescription. I think the potential usage of psychedelics goes well beyond that. I think many people throughout society can benefit from these in terms of increasing creativity and also just being able to understand the nature of consciousness better themselves. But then also, as I touched on at the end, I think this idea of the science of consciousness, I think psychedelics are going to play a crucial role in this in years to come in terms of actually understanding what is the nature of consciousness. For instance, is there a field of consciousness that our brains really effectively tap into? These types of ideas, because that's one of the subjective experiences that many people get when they take psychedelics. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Max. Thank you, everyone. My job today is to impress upon all of you that the single most important innovation in our lifetimes is not going to be something else that you can hold in your hand or maybe that you can drive down the street. It's going to be organic. It's going to be inside you and inside the people around you. And much like vaccination or the pill, it's going to change the world in fundamental, wonderful, huge, deeply important ways. You just might not see it every day, but it's going to change us. And it's going to change us because we are very, very complex creatures. Every single one of us here is a sort of walking miracle. You know, you possess the single most complex object in the known universe in terms of what's going on in here. Every single one of you, even the dumbest person you know, they still have one of these. It's utterly incredible. It's infinitely complex. And you are your brain, you know, you are your brain. It seems obvious, right? But that complexity means that your brain can go wrong in a myriad of different ways. And every single one of us will suffer in our lifetime. Every one of us. We all grieve. We all lose the ones that we loved, or they run off with someone else. We divorce. We get lifelong illnesses or chronic pain. And we are sad and we are depressed and we suffer in a myriad of different ways. And we need a very, very complicated treatment for this very complicated thing that causes all that suffering. And that's why we've got a crisis. And that crisis will be something that you hear on the news all the bloody time. Everyone wanging on about the mental health crisis because we're all depressed, right? And quite a few of us seek treatment. 1 in 5 men, 1 in 3 women go to the doctor maybe, they get prescribed antidepressants perhaps, but we all suffer. We all have our mental challenges. And quite a lot of people don't go to the doctor for any of those. There'll be a few people in this room who have tobacco addictions or alcohol addictions, let alone depression, anxiety, all of the other labels that we give to human suffering and the troubles that go on in here with our mental health. Suicide is still the leading cause of death amongst men under 50. Just think about that. Every single one of you, if you're not suffering right now, you know someone in your immediate circle that is. And you know someone that you've probably written off. You said they're too traumatized. We can't do anything about the fact that they're drinking themselves to death, that they're depressed. We're living this crisis. It's not a bunch of statistics on the news. It's in each and every one of us. But it also costs us a load of money, costs us loads of money. 1 in every £10 spent on the NHS, spent on our mental health. £100 billion, and you guys will know better than me, but I think that's almost double the defence budget. £100 billion that is sucked out of the economy by poor mental health. Depression is the single biggest driver of disability. Think of all those people sat at home, sitting in their beds, lying in their beds, not contributing to society, not because they don't want to, because they feel they can't in some ways. And let's think about the people who are working, the people who are on our ICU units, the people who went through coronavirus. 50% of them are deeply traumatized by what happened to them then, let alone some 20% perhaps of our military suffering from PTSD. That statistic about more of our soldiers dying from suicide coming home from Afghanistan and Iraq than died in conflict that we sent them to. We brought them back here and then we couldn't look after them properly. Oh, it makes me angry. And you're probably thinking, yes, Tara, but we do have antidepressants. SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor and antidepressants. Yes, and they were designed 50 years ago. 50 years ago. And my understanding is that if they were introduced to the market now, they probably wouldn't meet the requirements. The placebo effect was so powerful at the time. Of course they worked. Placebo is the most powerful effect in psychology. Of course they work. People want to get better. People want to be productive, happy people, members of society. Antidepressants won't work for some 30% of the population. So they won't work for everyone. They have a myriad of terrible, difficult side effects, things like loss of libido. That doesn't just affect you. That affects your wife. That affects your husband. That affects the people around you. And they can cause you to be suicidal, of course, as well. So lovely. It's pretty depressing, actually, the whole situation. And you will have heard it again and again and again on the news and on various television programs and lots of MPs talking about the mental health crisis in this country. And yet we have a medicine. We have a medicine. We have a medicine that works, that is safe, that is effective. And he's going to talk to you all about it, aren't you? So I don't have to do all of the really clever stuff, because the guys at Imperial, the guys at Johns Hopkins, they have been doing all the really hard work. And thank God they have, because I'm sick of the suffering. I'm fed up with it. I'm glad I'm living at this point in time, not 10 years ago, because it feels like we're finally on the cusp of getting this done. I think our children are going to look back and did you just really love suffering? What was it? Why did it take so long? And we could talk all day about why it took so long. The history of the drug war and the misuse of drug act that came from America in 1971. It's a long time ago, and we're living with the inertia because we have a medicine. It begins with the letter P. It sounds like S, psilocybin. There are others, but psilocybin or psilocybin, doesn't matter which side of the Atlantic you're on, it's all the same stuff. It grows out of the ground. It's abundant in the UK. It grows everywhere. You can grow it on top of your wardrobe if you really want to. It's pretty straightforward. It comes from a mushroom. It's a psychoactive compound in so-called magic mushrooms. And it's probably been used by humanity maybe as long as we've had this kind of hardware and this kind of brain. But we know, and I'm trying to gloss over this really, because Dr. Erritzøe is the world leading expert in this field. We know it works. We know that it is effective for even things like chronic tobacco addiction. We're looking at 80% success rates, abstinence at 6-month follow-up. You all know somebody who's got a tobacco addiction, and it will kill them eventually. This medicine, 1, maybe 2 doses in the clinical trials that are happening all over the world now, is showing people that they can live without depression. They can live without anxiety. They can live without alcohol or tobacco or gambling or OCD or anorexia. All of these studies happening where the mind has got stuck in some kind of maladaptive pattern of thought that says, I'm no good, nobody likes me. That woman at the shop, she looked at me funny and I'm no good and nobody loves me. Or I need a fag. I won't go into the mechanics of the default mode network and everything, but trust me, he's got it covered. Like, this is happening. It's happening in science. It's happening at our greatest universities, and it's safe, it's effective. And in comparison with something like escitalopram, the leading SSRI antidepressant, you are, as I understand it, twice as likely to be in remission from 1-2 doses of this medicine, psilocybin, than you are using the world's leading antidepressant. The graphs are pretty clear, and I haven't got them here, but I know which one I would rather take, because not only are you reducing the depressive symptoms from taking psilocybin versus escitalopram, you're also increasing your sense of well-being. And that's what we see all the time. Because the people behind all these mental health statistics, they say things like, I got my life back. They don't say, I'm no longer depressed. They say, I got my life back. I'll give you a quote here from one of the women that we work with. It took one small dose of psychedelics, lasting no more than a few hours, to help me cope with my cancer diagnosis. Years later, I continue to lead a fuller life because of it. I know that these drugs could really help people at the end of their life. The rules need to change. This is Dr. Laura McDonald. She's a young woman. She's a young woman. She's the same age as me. But she's a stage 4 cancer survivor. And she saw people dying all around her. And she had a diagnosis that meant she was staring death in the face. She also happens to be a medical doctor and a psychiatrist. And every day she's got people coming in to see her who are struggling with end-of-life distress, people that are not allowed in our country to access psilocybin legally, unless apparently if you bend down on the ground and you eat it directly from the floor, apparently that's legal according to Professor Nutt. But otherwise, unless you do that in October, you can't access it legally in this country. And maybe you haven't got until October. Maybe you haven't got very long left at all, and maybe you're absolutely terrified about death staring you in the face. This medicine gives people their lives back, even if they haven't got very long left. And that's what we've seen in Canada, incidentally. The movement in Canada where they have euthanasia, they've pushed the right to die, the right to try. You know, your own consciousness is being limited by the legalities around a medicine that is safe and effective and helps people and has helped however many people worldwide throughout its existence. I want to read you a quote from a young man that I know very well. He was a drug dealer, actually, and he was tortured by another drug gang. He forgave his torturer during his drug experience. But this message, he texted me. My brain is very different now. It's almost the same feeling as walking out of those prison gates. Weeks and weeks and weeks of struggling. Now I can focus. I just cannot believe that those few hours have managed to help my drug addiction, my PTSD, my focus, and my sleep. He went to Harley Street. They said to him, keep taking the ketamine, numb yourself to this pain that you're experiencing. He couldn't even sit still until he was able to access this medicine illegally in this country. There are people that are doing this all the time, and they are in a psychedelic elite. They are not a manual labourer with tobacco addiction who is slowly killing himself, who doesn't know about this stuff. He's never heard of it. But all across our country and in the royal palaces, there are people who are accessing psychedelic medicines to help with their conditions. There are people who are doing this in Canada, in America, in the Netherlands, in lots and lots of places all over the world. Why is it not happening here, apart from in a very, very limited way in our universities? The reason is that we're not only talking about something that is a Class A drug, okay? We're talking about something that is a Schedule 1 drug. Now, our little team, we call ourselves PAR, Psilocybin Access Rights, begins with an S, begins with P. It's annoying, but there we go. Sounds like a medicine, doesn't it? Psilocybin Access Rights. You know, we are fighting for the rescheduling of psilocybin. I wouldn't say we're not bothered about the classification, because let's just say there's probably quite a few people on our team who would very much like to be able to grow it themselves in their own home. But we're not asking to change the class of the drug. We're asking for science to be allowed to do science and for the scheduling to change. The scheduling relates to not whether you have some substance and you're on the street, can the police take it off you? How long do they lock you up for? That's the class. The scheduling relates to whether or not a licensed medical professional, a researcher, whether that person can legally access this substance. So morphine is a Class A drug. You better not have any on you right now. We're right outside the Home Office. It's a Class A drug, but it's a Schedule 2 substance. Why? Because every hospital pharmacy carries morphine. It's a medicine, and the hospital wouldn't function without it. And there are plenty of some psychedelics, in fact, that are sitting in Schedule 2. But psilocybin is not one of them. Psilocybin is in Schedule 1, which means it has apparently no known medical benefit, very clearly not true, as evidenced by Dr. Erritzøe and many others around the world. It's meant to be highly addictive, high potential for abuse. Again, as Max mentioned, Professor David Nutt suggests that this is not only not addictive, it is anti-addictive. I have seen with my own eyes a man who drank half a bottle of vodka at 6 in the morning, then drove his 3 children to school the following day, swearing off alcohol in a meaningful way, in a way that meant he he ran the London Marathon. He's clean. He stopped drinking. But not only did he stop drinking, he started to understand what was driving him to drink in the first place. And he started to treat that, to heal that, to address it. And we could talk all day about that. How far along am I? Okay. God, you could talk about all this stuff all day. I should say, okay, caveat. There's the big, on our website, we've got this great big, ugly disclaimer. These medicines are bloody powerful. Really, really powerful. They're very, very powerful. They're very, very complex. The ways in which they work is complex. They treat you in the way that you need to be treated. It's not like, I need to find the right therapist because I don't like that one, I don't like that one, I don't like that one. This works with you. No therapist is telling you what to do. The medicine is doing the work with you based on your challenges. But I cannot stand here and say, go out and do it. By all means, no. And that's why we are fighting for the rescheduling, because it's already happening. It's already happening every single day. There'll be hundreds of people across the capital, maybe thousands, even tonight, that will be accessing these medicines in an unregulated way, actually in a recreational way, because at very low doses, they have different properties from the more therapeutic, higher doses that are being used in the clinical trials. And in psychedelic therapy, we talk a great deal about set and setting. That is the mindset that you go into the experience with very quickly and the environment that is around you. And the kind of trials that are being run at Imperial, that set and that setting is very, very carefully managed. And you're literally lying in a bed with an eye mask on, listening to a pre-prepared playlist that is going to guide you probably through the most challenging experience of your life, possibly the most profound experience of your life, and the experience that makes you come out the other side and say, I've got my life back. I was in Afghanistan, or I was abused as a child, or I was tortured by another drug gang, and I've got my life back, and I can now contribute to society in a loving, meaningful way. Very, very powerful substances that can traumatize you with the wrong set and setting, maybe even in the right set and setting, maybe. But I would say to you this, that the sea is magnificent and beautiful, and no one can really explain to you, if you haven't seen it and you've never swum in it, just how beautiful and powerful and magical that experience could be. But they might tell you it could also kill you. It could kill you, it's incredibly dangerous, and you definitely don't go in there unless the conditions are absolutely right. But we do not ban people from swimming in the sea. We definitely don't ban people from swimming in the sea who desperately need to get wet and who desperately need to do that. We don't do that. We don't do that. In fact, maybe we'd say life isn't worth living if we would deny them this deeply important, profound experience, and perhaps the experience that could give them their life back. I said that enough, probably. So why is this not happening? And there's so many other conditions, as Max touched on. I mean, I've got a quote here from the director of Clusterbusters, because it's not just mental health. It's also things like cluster headaches. The brutality and the severity of the pain wreaks havoc on relationships, family life, employment and friendships. Our condition carries a suicide rate 20 times the national average. My experiences with psilocybin therapy were life-saving. This is a medicine that saves lives. It's already doing it, but it's doing it for this tiny little psychedelic elite. And you're now in the elite with me, okay? It's a cool club. But it needs to be happening. It needs to be happening a lot faster. We need to reschedule psilocybin, make it accessible for our medical professionals, for prescribers, and also for researchers. There is a wealth of data that exists. There's lots on our website. There's lots that you can see for yourselves. But there's so much more. There's more that needs to happen, particularly for me. In the field of things like Alzheimer's research, cognitive decline. We've seen some really promising studies with rats that show that the dendrites of the neurons grow after one high dose experience with psilocybin. Paul Stamets, who's like the mushroom man of the world, he talks about an increase in the TAP test, this cognitive function test, from taking lion's mane mushroom with psilocybin mushroom and niacin together, keeping the brain ticking over, causing neurogenesis. I'm not saying that we've got all the data we want on that yet. I am saying let the bloody researchers do the work. Okay, 20 minutes, I'm done. I'm just going to say the reason it's not happening is more inertia than it is It's not big pharma, for one thing. We can talk about that in Q&A or whatever. It's not them. Inertia, political inertia. We need you. We need the will of the people to push our beautiful new government, our fresh new government, to do something about this rather than sitting on their hands as they have been and pushing the can down the road. We've been doing an awful lot. The USA, Canada, Australia's already rescheduled. Things are happening all over the world. But if I say nothing else, you are very complex. We have a crisis, and the medicine that will help that complexity, we need access, and there is something that you can do about it. Join me. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara. Thank you, Max. So after these strong and very beautiful presentations on this topic, then I can already give an apology for mine at this point, probably be less coherent, because now I feel like trying to fill in potentially some gaps on all this that has been said already. So I obviously come from psychiatry, come from science, been studying these compounds for 20 years, mainly in the context of neuroscience, trying to understand how they work in the brain, how to use these drugs to understand the brain better. We have a whole sort of line of work that taps into what Max was alluding to about consciousness research, which is not exactly what I do. I'm more on the clinical side and brain science than specific consciousness research. But we're using the compounds in this sort of mind and consciousness expanding altered state to try and understand these aspects as well. But in particular, we're focusing on the mental health crisis coming from psychiatry, trying to use these tools and explore them, understand how can they be useful. And as you have heard, it sounds magical. It sounds like they just work for everything, and it's absolutely, the evidence is deeply solid, and it's a no-brainer. It should just come out to the market and be available. And you can push that argument, and you can see that some governments, including quite recently Australia, has in a way taken quite a dramatic step by rescheduling and therefore actually set up programs where clinicians can take courses and then apply for certificates to actually use psilocybin specifically for treatment-resistant depression, and also MDMA or ecstasy, the ecstasy compound MDMA, for post-traumatic stress. And that's because in a way that's before any authority anywhere have fully evaluated the full package of trial data on these compounds. So that is quite a brave move to do that. And at some point you can argue that, you know, you always need more evidence. You always need to know more. Do we know enough about the durability of these compounds and their effects? Probably not. But the data is strong enough to, at this point, to see that they're very safe, and that the effect sizes, so in a way the size of the effects compared to other treatments that we know about. So for depression, it would be conventional antidepressant medication, SSRIs. It would be talking therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy. And we can see that, you know, the effect sizes are 2 to 3 times what we see in those established conventional treatment models. So that, and that they seem very safe. So that already, that's why the push is there to get it out there, and then in a way maybe start carefully monitoring the real world clinical use of them, and just get the ball rolling, get started. I'm personally a little bit more like cautious that, or maybe wait for the trials to be complete and, you know, have a bit more evidence, and let the regulatory bodies evaluate and make their decisions. And that is currently what's also happening. So in parallel with countries like Australia setting it a bit loose, monitoring it, you have the FDA, which is the regulatory body in the US, overseeing and deciding on licensing new treatments. They are sitting with the MDMA data for post-traumatic stress disorder treatment, and there's been a pushback a few weeks ago. That's actually quite an important pushback, because so far over the last several years, we at Imperial, Johns Hopkins, we've been the two sort of, I would say, early running leading institutions in the academic field of this science, and a lot of others since then, and a lot of others, including in upcoming companies in the space, are deeply excited, and everything has been surprisingly positive. And as you can hear, the enthusiasm, that enthusiasm is not just Tara and Max, It's a lot of people out there. So the biggest pushback actually came a few weeks ago, where there was an FDA committee that was supposed to, they wrote a report and gave their opinion to the FDA of what they should do in terms of MDMA for PTSD. And they basically said, no, do not approve it. So that means that's the reason, the most recent development is actually a massive setback. So we will now see, I think it's 11th of August, where the FDA will make the decisions about MDMA for PTSD. And that is coming a year at least ahead of the next thing, which will be psilocybin for depression. So that's where it is in the development. And we can get back to if people are interested in what are the pushbacks and what are the hurdles. But just to give you context, so despite I actually fully agree with what has been said. There's super evidence for end of life distress. There's some evidence for OCD. It also depends a bit on what compounds we are talking about. There's a bit of a mix of a lot of compounds. And that brings me to give you a very brief overview of what compounds we're actually talking about. Because when people talk about psychedelics, they actually sometimes refer to different ways of categorizing the drugs. So sometimes ketamine is put in that pool, MDMA put in that pool, but the classic psychedelics, they are not ketamine, they're not MDMA. They are let's call them atypical psychedelics. They overlap, but they are pharmacologically different. Their brain effects are a bit different, and the phenomenology a bit different. So they are not the same, but they overlap. The classic psychedelics are, as been mentioned, LSD, psilocybin, DMT, which is the psychedelic compound in ayahuasca, an Amazonian brew coming from different elements from nature. And those are very similar in pharmacology and brain effects. And they are the ones that really create a very expanded state of consciousness and can be quite challenging, overwhelming, difficult experience, but also incredibly beautiful, blissful, insightful, and meaning generating, and have a lot of psychological material surfacing in these experiences. And that is what we are trying to harvest the fruit of by embedding them in psychological support / proper psychotherapy. And they are not particularly safely used without a package of therapy. There needs to be a preparation phase with experienced therapists and support around them, and psychological integration work happening after. So that's how the classic psychedelics in full doses that actually give this alter state tripping, which is what we're using in these trials, and what the development is, which is completely different to Paul Stamets and what Max was also talking about, microdosing. It's the same drugs in tiny sub-perceptual doses, where you take it repeatedly instead of having one profound session with therapy. You people are in Silicon Valley, massive popular phenomenon, super hyped phenomenon. So that's a different model, using the same drugs in a different way. But they need to be embedded safely in therapy, whereas ketamine, already existing as a medicine, it comes from medicine, it's already there, it's used in anesthetics, and then it has been repurposed for mental health because it turned out it had antidepressant effect. Then a company called Johnson, they developed and patented a specific version of ketamine and licensed it in a nasal spray formulation called Spravato, and then they're earning a lot of money on that. They stripped away the psychological support element to it, and that means that you just need more drug, which is kind of smart model in terms of your pharma company, because you need to give a lot of that drug. Whereas you use the super cheap, already existing ketamine from anesthetics, and you embed that in talking therapies, if anything, more efficient and cost nothing apart from the therapy. And so you can use these drugs to catalyze therapeutic processes massively, and that's where it's exciting. It's a deeply exciting paradigm because it's the melting point, meeting point between psychology and psychiatry. It's actually incredibly beautiful. You know that in mental health you have the psychiatrist, we can sit there and we can prescribe this and change medication, and then you have some psychologists doing the therapy and not speaking that much together. It's not actually that sort of built into the same model. And this model actually has all the components within the same model. And you have that amazing thing that it's an intervention. It's a single experience or a few experiences. It's not that you are parked on a script in a corner for years and a month or years or forever. it is an intervention where you use important elements of therapy combined with pharmacology that induces these remarkable effects. In terms of why we think that they are so, how is it possible that you can have a drug in your body and then when the drug is gone, you still have the effects? That's not normal. Normally, medicines, they work when they are in the body. There's not any experience associated with taking any drugs in mental health apart from these new compounds. So the new paradigm is that there's an experience, profound experience, part of the pharmacological model, and then embedded in talking therapy to proper harvest the fruit and make it safe. So it's a beautiful meeting point between psychology and psychiatry. And one of the reasons why we believe that they have these long duration of effects. So ketamine, if you give a single dose of ketamine, it has immediate antidepressant, anti-suicidal effect, great, but it only lasts around a week. So therefore you have this repeated model where you do multiple doses over some weeks. Why the classic psychedelics such as psilocybin has induced such an insane hype and enthusiasm, and why companies have been spiraling out of nowhere and set up in order to ride the wave of gold here and try to develop these compounds and make new patented version of all of it. That's because the duration of effects after single intervention seem even longer than that. So probably ketamine has been coined by Tom Insel, who was head of the NIMH in the US, as the most important thing that happened in psychiatry for the last 40 years. And what these psychedelics, the classics, psilocybin, they seem to have even more powerful effects, even more durable effects. And one of the reasons is probably related to the actual nature of the experience and the profoundness of the experience. We can see associations between meshes of how profound this altered state is in terms of the psychological peak element or mystical type experiences that these compounds produce and the effects, the treatment effects. If we associate how much are you improving in your depression with the nature and profoundness of experience, there's associations almost across all trials, also across indications with these classic psychedelics, and that the duration is longer. And that is remarkable that you have relatively long effects after single intervention. We are not used to that, apart from maybe ECT, which is not pharmacological, but an electrical stimulation in psychiatry. And what we know now with these compounds is that it was mentioned before in rat models that they induce plasticity in the brain, so they induce rewiring. So you're basically opening biologically a window of plasticity in the brain where the brain is very, very plastic and moldable. And also we can see that the hierarchy of the brain function is changed, partly broken down during an experience. And why is that important? That is important because the current neuroscience concept of how to understand the brain and how to understand mental health is very related to a prediction error model. So basically, see the model as a prediction machine. So everything we perceive, the way we understand ourselves, the way we perceive the world around us, everything coming in through our senses, is actually not exactly the way we understand it, the way we perceive it is not exactly what's coming in through our senses. It's in order to make the brain efficient. For instance, if I just opened my eyes here, looked at you, I wouldn't have to take in all visual impressions. I already have a model of that this is probably a room full of people. So I basically take quick perceptual impression, hold it up against already built brain models of the world around me, and then just check it very quickly. That's how the brain operates, and then decides that that is what it is. That is also why visual illusions work, right? You can be cheated because you have these inner models. So that's why you can be cheated by visual illusions. Like if you see a face turning and it's actually a mask, it keeps looking like a face because you are used to a face being convex and not concave. So you can be cheated, and that's because you have this top-down regulation of everything that comes in that then makes you perceive it in a specific way. Those brain models that have this top-down control over how we understand the world, they can be maladaptive. So if you are suffering quite severe depression, your inner models are constantly overturning whatever comes in and make you, like Tara was alluding to, conclude that somebody who is not who's not saying hi to you in the street, it's because they don't like you. You're not worth saying hi to. But it might be that they just didn't see you. So if you're very depressed, those models will overturn this. And what we can see with the psychedelics in terms of mechanisms is that some of that hierarchy is partly broken down. So instead of having this top down, maybe there's more bottom up, where you can reshape your models, and that will, with this foundation of brain plasticity happening, you then have a golden opportunity to actually reshape your models and therefore have much more enduring changes. But that means that the window of this plasticity needs to be harvested in a positive way. That's why the therapy and the support and the setting, all that is important. That's why we pay attention to the actual context, even the room, the music, the light, and the therapeutic input around it, because it's such a fragile, vulnerable state, full of suggestibility, full of plasticity, that needs to be handled very gentle. And that's also why it's a massive threat that some of the companies in the space, including the recent some of the recent situation with MDMA, there's a pushback from some of the companies because the therapy element, the soft element of this pharma development of these drugs, the regulatory bodies, they're not set up to regulate it. They're not set up to approve them. So that means the companies then strategically try to reduce that out of the models in order to get it through a system. It's basically a square brick through a round hole. The system is not set up to this model that have talking therapy mixed into pharmacology. So therefore, and that's the danger right now, that then the talking therapy element is trying to be sort of taken a bit out in order to, and that is basically deeply suboptimal. So that's one of the threats. And also, all the efficacy stuff, if it's depression, we talk about severity of depression. If it's alcohol, maybe drinking days. But I will mention a few additional reasons why this new model is very appealing, because it's not just those classic measures of efficacy. When we do our trials, across many trials, including the one where we compare to escitalopram, what we see also compared to a classic gold standard, best performing SSRI drug like escitalopram, what we see with psilocybin in this case, we see that in addition to performing better in terms of treatment response, with some of the measures at least, we see specific differences as well. We see, instead of sexual dysfunction, as we often see with antidepressants, we see the opposite. Instead of we see people having more joy out of their sex life. In terms of emotional lability and ability to approach, feel, be in touch with your emotions, ability to cry, with SSRIs, for a lot of people, there's a blunting, flattening of affect that comes with the treatment model with SSRI. What we see with psilocybin directly compared to it is the opposite. We see increased ability to cry. We see more emotionality. So it's not just about the actual hard measure of depression severity, it's also other aspects. We see increased connectedness. We see that experiential avoidance, which is a common feature across mental health, which is this deeply problem of even approaching the pain that is in the core of your suffering because it's too painful. We see that avoidance turns into acceptance. We see increase in nature relatedness, which is pretty cool also in the context of what's the whole global warming thing and the way we treat nature. And we also see increased openness to experience other people's values, even kind of in a, I don't want to be political, but that's related to some political, anyway, it doesn't matter. Increased agreeableness and pro-social features we can measure. So a lot of additional features that are just not the typical main outcomes predefined in testing of mental health. So there's these additional values. And then just to put a spanner in the wheel in terms of microdosing evidence and Paul Stamets, we are a little bit like the party poopers when it comes to microdosing, because we have been studying it quite carefully. And basically, microdosing, yes, it works if you totally forget about placebo. Okay, so it's very hyped. People are full of expectations. You have amazing results on no matter what you measure, whether it's creativity, anything, mental health. But the more you work yourself up in the hierarchy of evidence, where you have better and more tightly designed trials with more control condition and placebo, you lose the effects. So basically, microdosing, one big fat question mark. Yes, it's amazing if you don't mind whether it's all placebo, because the placebo effect can be massive. And if it's really hyped and the expectancies are really high, you might get insane placebo effects, which is fantastic. But we are the party poopers, because the more we speak about it, the more that placebo effect might be slightly reduced, because we can see that in our trial, we tested it in a very, very novel way. And we basically could see that the effects of thinking you actually took a microdose was 10 times higher than actually the effect of the microdose. So thinking you took it had 10 times more predictive value for positive outcomes than actually taking it. So if you took placebo, thought you were microdosing, it worked great. If you did the opposite, it didn't work that great. So anyway, so that's just a spanner in the wheel for microdosing. Yeah, I'll stop there.